classic rock fans, to another one of my top 10 ranking videos, and today we're looking at the 10 best progressive rock albums. Now when I say 10 best, what I really mean is my 10 personal favourites. To make this list more interesting, I've excluded live albums, which are in effect just compilation albums, and I've only included one album by one band. Anyway, before we get started, please make sure to click like, subscribe, and click that bell so you get notified of any future uploads. And for additional content and other ways you can support my channel, please do check out my Patreon. Number 10 is Yeti from 1970 by Amon, Düül 2. I love the meandering vibe and mood of the music on this album. In fact, a lot of it is in fact improvisational. It meanders with a sense of psychedelic abandon. You know, I love that sort of vague, trippy formlessness that emanated from Haight-Ashbury in 1967. But of course this is not San Francisco, this is in fact the genesis of kraut rock, a term I believe was penned by John Peel. Interestingly, of course, the term kraut rock is used as a pejorative by the West German press at this time. The music on this record is infused with heavy sustained guitars and very dramatic random percussive flourishes. As I've said, it does have that made up as you go along feel to it. In fact, it was Frank Zappa that said, I may quote, "If they would be a little bit more organised, Amon Düül would be the biggest band in the world." Hyperbole indeed. But certainly the music on this record, there's no doubt about it, can be described as raw and ephemeral, full of rapid and random chord progressions and murmurings of what was to come. And this primal primitivism very much defines the sound of their debut album, and in fact is carried across onto their second album, Yeti, an album described by Ultimate Classic Rock as unfettered experimentation with style and form. They go on to say, of course, that this album makes Pink Floyd's Ummagumma seem like an exercise in brevity and discipline. Certainly those of you who have been watching my videos for a while know how much I just dig this trippy shit. And this album certainly floats my boat, albeit drifting along on a river, gazing up at marmalade skies, etc, etc. It's heady, untamed, trance-inducing stuff, and God bless them for that. Lester Bangs goes on to describe Amon Düül as Germany's great psych overload band. And it does seem on this album that everything is cranked up a notch or two. It's certainly heavier, hairier and louder than the first. The music is a wonderful blend of American psychedelia. We can hear elements of the avant-garde, certainly the Velvet Underground and Frank Zappa and the Mothers, all forming this sort of wonderful sonic splodge. And I just love it, the sound, the mood, and the form of their formlessness. If we think about some of the tracks of this record, which expands over 4 sides of vinyl, of course, we get Soap Shock Rock, Archangel Thunderbird, and the wonderful Sandoz in the Rain, which was allegedly recorded while the whole band were tripping on LSD. As I've said, a lot of this album is our sort of improvisational jams, but it just all works well for me. It's almost as if it indulges my interest in prog while fanning the flames of my ardour for psychedelia. But saying that, it does have a kind of an earnest folkiness to it, whilst bubbling beneath the surface is certainly a dark and malevolent quality. But there is also what I call a thick as a brick lampooning quality to it. The band have gone on to say that they wanted to make fun of the high art aesthetics of a lot of what was happening around them at the time, a culture that they felt ultimately excluded from. Ultimately, I think they've produced a great album. Number 9 is Pawn Hearts from 1971 by Van der Graaf Generator. This is the band's 4th album and features contributions by Robert Fripp. Many have dismissed this album as heady and confusing, but to be honest with you, that's part of the appeal for me. You get that wonderful track on there, the 23-minute A Plague of Lighthouse Keepers, which one waggish journalist has said it makes King Crimson sound like the Ramones. But that's what's wonderful about this music. It's vast, spacey, with lots of random shifts in time and sequence, with great lines like, "When you see the skeletons of sailing ships' spars sinking low, you'll begin to wonder if the points of all the ancient myths are solemnly directed straight at you." Stirring stuff. I think Pawn Hearts is this band's magnus opus, or magnificent octopus as Baldrick might say, but we'll come on to the magnificent octopus in a moment. The music on this album is vast, majestic, complex, and completely insane. I love the way it meanders and drifts, but also has a darkness that underlies it all. It bristles with a sense of malevolent unease. In fact, the music critic John Miles has gone on to say it sounds like music authored by a complete genius, unfortunately locked away in an insane asylum. The track listing on this record consists of just 3 numbers, all employing what I call a disharmonic energy. It has a lot in common with King Crimson in that respect, in the sense that the melodic lines juxtaposed with several disharmonic threads. You can certainly see why Fripp got involved with this one. Lemmings, including Cog, rails against the collective suicidal tendencies of the human race. And I love the way it starts, has quite a soft acoustic beginning, but it ends rather suddenly and abruptly, which thematically, that's probably the point, isn't it? And of course the aforementioned Plague of Lighthouse Keepers, which is broken up into 10 sections. It's a remarkable wandering piece of work that deals with the isolation of a lighthouse keeper and his complete descent into lunacy. It's a study of sheer terror as he loses his grasp on his perceived self and the reality of the world around him. There's no doubt that Pawn Hearts is a challenging and complex listen. It's multifaceted, dense lyrics, exquisite instrumentation. It's all exploring some pretty dark stuff as well. There's no doubt that this is a prog classic by any stretch of the imagination. And believe me, the imagination is uncompromisingly stretched on this one. Number 8 is music inspired by The Snow Goose by Camel from 1975. After the dark intensity of Pawn Hearts, this one feels like a refreshing stroll on a December morning, which delves into the realm of fairy tale and symbolism with its intricate compositions and mythopoetic lyrics. And it's a wonderful, exquisite guitar playing of Andy Latimer that really brings this to life with his expert use of phrasing and technique. It's of course a story based on Paul Gallico's The Snow Goose, a parable on the regenerative power of love and friendship set against the harsh realities of war. The central motif, of course, is the rescued snow goose that becomes a symbol of friendship and hope. And it's the band's music beautifully underpins this. This is not the first time the band had explored literary themes. On their Mirage album, they'd done the White Rider Suite, which was based on Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. The writer Paul Gallico was not particularly impressed with the idea that Camel wanted to use his book for an album. In fact, they had to change the album title from The Snow Goose to music inspired by the Snow Goose. I read somewhere that they actually wanted to use some of the text from the book to inspire the lyrics for the album, but Paul Gallico objected to that as well, and in the end the album just turned out to be an instrumental, although an instrumental piece of unique beauty as far as I'm concerned. The playing on this album is absolutely fantastic, and the sort of tonal quality of it beautifully underpins that theme of friendship and love. It's the band employ an economy of musical phrasing that doesn't drift and sort of self-indulgent noodling. The brushstrokes are light and delicate, beautifully serving the juxtaposition of this music with Gallico's story. And there are no epic, sprawling pieces on this record. They're all fairly short, like an oral metaphor, symptomatic of the little passages of life and time passing, whilst friendship and the symbol of the snow goose endures. One of the things I love about the music on this record, and one of the things I admire Camel for, and perhaps sets them apart from their prog brethren, is that the soloing is very much in keeping with the melodic lines of the overall composition. They don't spin off into a prog forest of extravagance and obfuscation. This is a great album by a much overlooked band. Number 7 is Brain Salad Surgery by Emerson, Lake and Palmer from 1972. William Shatner famously said that progressive rock is the science fiction of music, and looking at this album you'd be inclined to concede that he had a point. Of course, this is the band that was dismissed by John Peel as a waste of talent and electricity, never actually forgiving Keith Emerson for disbanding the Nice or leaving the Nice. However, John Peel was never a fan of the whole progressive rock thing anyway. He saw it as the epitome of hubris, and for many critics, Emerson, Lake and Palmer are that band. Nevertheless, I find that there is a perfect balance struck on this record, a perfect balance between the keyboard pyrotechnics of Keith Emerson, of course, the incendiary drumming of Carl Palmer, and the beautiful, exquisite vocal performance of Greg Lake. It all comes together quite beautifully on this record. And after this one, I think the band tend to wander off into that aforementioned prog forest of obfuscation and extravagance. But as I've said on this one, you get that perfect balance between the bombast and the brilliance. From the rousing Jerusalem to the funky Baroque folk rock of Still You Turn Me On, And let's not forget the multi-part dystopian fantasy, which is Carnival 9. All these numbers enthrall and mesmerise, contained on an album that has ultimately taken its title from the lyric in a Dr. John song. But Carnival 9 has a volume and a vengeance that found the band a new audience in metal fans, as you get that wonderful juxtaposition of competing between Keith Emerson's keyboards and some quite nice crunchy guitar parts. Carnival 9, of course, which emerges from the fragments of what the band had already had or toying with, eventually emerges as this evocative and carnivalesque nightmare, incorporating, of course, the first prototype Moog Apollo, the first polyphonic synthesizer. I personally believe that a lot of the material on this album is some of the best the band have ever produced, from that rousing rendition of Sir Charles Hubert Parry's Jerusalem, his setting for the William Blake poem, of course, which got the song banned from the BBC, as many felt it was irreverent and blasphemous even. But I can't help but feel it's incredibly relevant and ballsy. I think if William Blake had been alive, he would have approved of this. The working title of this album was Whip Some Skull on Ya, which is a euphemistic term for fellatio, a term which I believe was also borrowed from Dr. John. But of course the record company wouldn't allow it, as they saw it was felt it was obscene, a decision that the band found hard to swallow, if you excuse the pun. And this thread or idea was certainly explored in H.R. Giger's artwork, which actually included a phallus as well, which, of course, the record company were never going to allow that, so the band had to employ somebody who was an artist who was an expert at cock obscuring, who managed to airbrush it out and make it look like a shaft of light. This album for me is a glorious exercise in collaborative pomp of a saber-rattling band, to quote Carl Palmer, before they begin to fragment and subsequently drift away on their subsequent albums. And this is a collection of songs that has a distinctive live feel. Unlike Trilogy, of course, which a lot of it was very difficult to replicate live, they decided they wanted to go for something that felt more unaffected and untampered with. I think they even purchased a theatre, stripped all the seats out and performed and recorded in there to give it that sort of sense of performance, that sense of live feel. And it has to be said, of course, that the results were absolutely fabulous. Therefore, number 7 on my list is Brain Salad Surgery from Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Number 6 is Octopus by Gentle Giant from 1972. Baroque counterpoint harmonies, medieval flourishes, and even some sort of funk and hard rock sort of passages and hooks all contribute to the sound of this record, which is perhaps best described as the bastard progeny of William Byrd and Frank Zappa and the Mothers. Originally, the album was going to be called Octo Opuses, each one representing the member of the band. But this, of course, was dropped and it morphed into something much more than that. Even the opening track, Panurge, is a remarkable blending of classical and contemporary forms, and any band that references Francois Rabelais is okay in my book. For me, it's the diverse and intricate instrumentation that really sells this record for me. Not to mention that the intertwining voices, polyphonic voices in the opening track, which are absolutely fascinating to listen to. Not to mention the band's use of rhythmic suspension, which is used perfectly on this track, which is effectively the notes being stretched over across the beats, which creates a jarring, unsettling feel. But nevertheless, it makes for a fascinating listen. And the sheer range of instruments that they use on this album makes me wonder how they ever managed to produce it live. It's absolutely mind-boggling. But nevertheless, it creates a very rich, interesting tapestry of sound. For me, Gentle Giant represent the mad scientists of the prog world, from very complex medieval-sounding madrigals to some quite funky, rocky-sounding numbers on this one. In fact, David Shulman said of this record, I think this album was the culmination of what and where this band were headed into for the rest of the decade. The track Knots, of course, is a fragmented title. It's based on the R.D. Lang book of the same title. And it's a track made up of fragmented conversations and fragmented narratives that build a kind of almost a patchwork quilt of strange and eclectic experiences. For me, it's hard to imagine any top 10 prog list without this album, an album that is a beautiful melding of medieval chamber music and contemporary musical forms. This musical cross-pollination is prog at its very best. Number 5 is Larks, Tongues in Aspic by King Crimson from 1973. Frank Zappa famously said that jazz isn't dead, it just smells funny. I think he was alluding to certain progressive elements in popular music in the late 60s. But certainly in 1969, these progressive elements announced themselves with the punishing 21st Century Schizoid Man, a song that actually had the Stones break out into a cold sweat in Hyde Park that very same year. This is the group's 5th album, I believe, and it's a transitional album for the band. In fact, I'd argue that most King Crimson albums are transitional albums. It's a masterful sonic tapestry comprised of intricate music and a whole cacophony of clattering trays, chiming bells and twittering birds. I think we have to doff our cap to the brilliance that was Jamie Muir at this point. This album incorporates some wonderful freeform jazz improvisations, some Eastern European classical influence, and of course some aspects of proto-metal. But as I said, this is a transitional record. You've got to remember that the band had been disbanded, so to speak, after the Islands record, and we got a totally new lineup of King Crimson. He pieced together a whole new lineup, of course, which famously included Bill Bruford and John Wetton. Of course, Fripp and Bruford had actually stated for this record that they were inspired, that this lineup was brought together by a fortuitous and benevolent spirit, whatever that means. I read in an interesting article about King Crimson that this album specifically incorporates rhythmic and polyrhythmic motifs. This obviously provides the bedrock for what does at times sound like some sort of free-form improvisation, which is quite an interesting direction for this band. Because before then, I always got the impression that they were so tightly wound up that you couldn't break wind in King Crimson without it being pre-approved and somehow justified as contributing to the aesthetic whole. But the very improvisational nature of some of the aspects of this record does throw up some interesting sonic possibilities. In fact, if I may quote Jessie Brown, she writes, "It combines elements of Hendrix with classical music theory and structure gleaned from Stravinsky, effectively creating a distinctly non-Western sound that is both innovative and classically rooted." Of course, the title track is divided into part 1 and part 2. Part 1, of course, is a 13.5-minute polyrhythmic rhapsody of sound, employing very dissonant sounding chord changes and interesting time signatures. The track is loosely based, of course, on Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, Mystic Circles of the Young Girls. It sounds like a darker and more intense version of what Frank Zappa and the Mothers were doing in the late 60s. Part 2 is more succinct, I believe, but it still incorporates some very interesting sort of percussive flourishes and draws heavily upon that Eastern European classical tradition, still employing that the aesthetic principle that they wanted to drive forward for this one, which is definitely sort of free-form improvisation. Like everything this band does, it's meticulous and the epitome of perfection as far as I'm concerned. We're taking on this musical odyssey of dissonant and strange sounds and textures. And it's certainly a compelling listen. It's like a magical excursion into this free-form fantasy world where Stravinsky rules supreme. Number 4 is Selling England by the Pound by Genesis from 1973. On this album we get the dreams of merry old England sort of transmogrifying horribly into consumerist nightmares as Gabriel sings, "Can you tell me where my country lies?" further embodying that English mythos as he dresses as the Knight Britannia and stalks the stages of that subsequent tour. This album is a whimsical meditation on national identity. It's a pastoral yearning and espouses the desire to return to past times. But it's a surreal form of nostalgia in many respects, especially as it follows hard upon the very apocalyptic sounding foxtrot. But on this one, of course, we get the sense that it's the old order that's in decline. Now, interestingly, Ray Davies produces some wonderful vignettes on the nature of Englishness on the absolutely sublime The Kinks of Village Green Preservation Society, where England becomes a microcosm of homemade jam and country fates. But it's an affectionate mocking, a rather skewed look at what it is to be English, wrapped up in these little rituals. Genesis, by contrast, employ much broader strokes. If we take, for example, Dancing with the Moonlit Night, it's a wonderful example of this, with its folk roots morphing to this grand Elgar-esque jazz rock opus. And it's a track, of course, that begins a series of little ambient yearnings for old England. I read an article interesting on the BBC about this record. If I quote, "By this point, Collins' jazz rock drumming was transforming their set pieces into much sprightlier offerings, such as the second part to the cinema show, where Gabriel's love of T.S. Eliot also comes to the fore. But it's textures like this that make this record absolutely remarkable as far as I'm concerned. Not just the drumming of Collins, but of course the wonderful guitar work of Steve Hackett's, Peter Gabriel's flute, and the certain synth textures that Peter Banks explores on this one. We even get flourishes of what could be considered Pythonesque with the Battle of Epping Forest, where with its comedy clashing, no pun intended, with the violence of its subject matter. On this one, of course, Gabriel employs very gangster-sounding voices, which gives it a very modern twist. I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe is an interesting sideward look at rather odd characters in these little village settings. On Selling England by the Pound, we get this confluence of beautiful atmospheric colouring haunted by the ghosts of Edwardian England, combined with pithy observations, catchy melodies, and exquisite arrangements. This album is the pinnacle of the Genesis Gabriel era as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I know some of you will argue that is in fact The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, but for me the subject matter is far more compelling. This album feels more modern now than it perhaps did at the time in many respects, certainly with the political zeitgeist that England and a lot of European countries now redefining themselves along nationalist lines. It certainly makes for an interesting listen. Number 3 is Tales from Topographic Oceans by Yes from 1973. Yes's 1973 opus is based upon a footnote in the autobiography Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda. It's 4 sides of vinyl, of course, each side containing a meditation on a specific Shastra, only in the 1970s, eh? Rick Wakeman considers this album to be Yes's Marmite album. In fact, a friend of mine even describes this as a journey into the heart of dullness. Obviously a big fan. But I see this as a beautiful mapping out of a spiritual journey. We get revealing what is heard, remembering what is remembered, ancient of ancient times, and ritual, of course, about rites and traditions. For many, this is the epitome of bloated and overconsidered artistic forays that demanded, necessitated the call for anarchy in the UK of just a few years later, which is unfortunate in many respects, because I think we had a whole generation of youngsters looking at progressive rock through the distorting lens of punk. Rick Wakeman has said that this is a wonderful single album, but it's a bloated double album full of filler. I have to admit, listening to it, there are certain aspects where I feel they've just gone on a little bit too long here, but nevertheless I find it a beautiful and immersive listen. Of course, Lester Bangs was very critical, but Lester Bangs was very critical of prog in general. For him, as far as he's concerned, that rock and roll should stay faithful to its very black American roots, and he saw progressive rock as leaning more towards white European classical influences, which he just didn't like. And there is an element of truth in that, because progressive rock does draw its influences from a very European romantic tradition, quite far away from that black American idiom that Lester Bangs so revered. But I would argue, of course, that progressive rock also incorporates a lot of jazz influences. And forgive me if I'm wrong, but is not jazz also drawn from a black American tradition? I read in an interesting article that one critic argued that the appeal of this record is technological, rather than its rather faux spiritual esoteric pretensions. I couldn't disagree more. The music for me expresses the very essence of a spiritual quest. In fact, it even opens in almost like a mantra. It has a chant-like quality. In terms of artistically, where Yes Are, you can view this record as a continuation of the brilliance that was Close to the Edge and Fragile, or you could in fact see it as a tipping point where they finally tip over into artistic hubris, which is the point I think Rick Wakeman is making. But for me, this album contains some of the most beautiful and sublime musical passages this band have ever produced. In fact, I'm reminded of a quote by the German poet Bertolt Arbach, where he says that music washes away from the soul the dust of everyday life. And certainly some of the instrumental passages on this record, especially Steve Howe's guitar work, has an almost cleansing feel to it. It's a remarkable journey across a very strange musical landscape. I would encourage everyone to take a plunge in these very enriching sonic oceans. It's a thoroughly rewarding experience. They went to sea in a sieve they did, in a sieve they went to sea. Number 2 is A Passion Play by Jethro Tull from 1973. For me, this is a really interesting album. It's one where the band move away from prog parody, so to speak, with their mother of all concept albums from 1972, to actually embrace prog itself. On this one, of course, it's a dark concept as we journey with Ronnie Pilgrim from his death on the Fulham Road, to the fiery abyss, or the foot of the stairs as Anderson likes to euphemistically refer to it. It is of course quite a dark theme, like a lot of the albums on this list, but this of course is infused with Anderson's wry observational humour. It's a bit like Dante melded with Monty Python at times. Obviously this whole hellscape thing fires Anderson's imagination, as indeed it does mine, but it was a theme or idea that was to be explored with the War Child project, the War Child film, which never came to fruition. In fact, it never saw the light of day until quite recently Stephen Wilson released the orchestral score. It is of course a fascinating concept as we journey with Ronnie Pilgrim's soul from his body on the Fulham Road all the way to heaven and the memory bank, the kind of a viewing room where his life is played back to him. And eventually, of course, he wishes to see hell. God calls him a rather silly fellow, I think, and he descends to the foot of the stairs, but finds that the abyss is not really for him either. I read somewhere that this album was supposed to be a double album. I think it would have been absolutely remarkable had it been. But of course, I always think of it as a double album because when I listen to this package, I combine it with those Chateau d'Arville recordings, waggishly dubbed the Chateau Disaster tapes by Anderson in 1988. Of course, the band abandon the project and fly back to England where they record the Passion Play as it is. It's only in recent times, of course, that we've been allowed access to these recordings. And combine them together, I think it makes an absolutely remarkable, immersive and conceptual experience. Of course, a Passion Play was essentially a medieval construct that would effectively deal with the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But of course, on this album, it's the death and resurrection of Ronnie Pilgrim which concerns us. It's a fascinating concept as we follow the progress of Ronnie Pilgrim's soul from his death on the Fulham Road all the way through to heaven, to the memory bank and the viewing room where his life is played back to him, till he descends into the fiery nether regions. Even his name, of course, Ronnie Pilgrim, is a nod and a wink to other spiritual confessional literature of the 17th century. I am, of course, alluding to John Bunyan's A Pilgrim's Progress. But it's an interesting theological point that Anderson is making. Of course, Ronnie Pilgrim comes to the conclusion that he is not good enough for heaven, but he's not quite bad enough for hell. In fact, he refers to Satan as an awful fellow. So Ronnie Pilgrim becomes a kind of an everyman figure. He effectively becomes us, so to speak. The only part of this record that I don't really get on with is the hare that lost his spectacles. I can only assume that staying in that theatrical conceit, this is supposed to be some sort of theatrical interlude, perhaps. There's no doubt about it, this is Tull's Marmite album. A lot of listeners to this day, if you watch my Jethro Tull's Worst to Best and read the comments, a lot of listeners today still find this album quite difficult and quite challenging. In fact, even Martin Barr has gone on record as saying that he felt that it was over-considered and over-convoluted. Certainly keeping with that whole sort of theatrical motif, the album is broken up into acts. We even got a lovely theatre programme with the original vinyl release, if you remember. But it's a wonderfully dense and textured prog foray that takes us deep into sort of liturgical matters, no stranger to Ian Anderson, of course, that explores church dogma in terms of life and the afterlife. But it has much further reaching questions in terms of the question of what is a good life, which as a listener I find thoroughly engaging. So number 2 for me on my prog list is Jethro Tull's A Passion Play from 1973. And number 1 is Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd from 1973. Pink Floyd, of course, abandoned the gnomes and sprites and affected innocence of the Barrett era in 1968, and they embark on a long, strange trip of sonic landscaping, a period affectionately referred to as psychedelic noodling by David Gilmour. Their sound becomes vast, more spatial than space rock, not that they ever were, of course, as they progress towards their conceptual masterpiece. And it's a conceptual masterpiece that beautifully details what it is to be human and the choices that we are faced with and how these choices ultimately affect us. This album, of course, was described as lean prog by Rolling Stone magazine, but I find it's perfectly balanced. There's no fat on it whatsoever. But it's an album which sees a band working together beautifully with one objective, unlike what happens after this album. Of course, this album has become very much part of the popular consciousness, and its iconic prism sleeve now stares out at us from numerous coffee mugs and coasters and t-shirts as each generation becomes captivated with its uncompromising portrayal of the permanent truth of things. Its ticking clocks and ka-chinging cash registers continue to resonate with us long after that final heartbeat has ceased to sound. From the sonic collage that begins this album, the album's overture if you like, to Breathe, of course, is opening iconic chords of Breathe, which John Harris, if you read his book on Dark Side of the Moon, he insists that Roger Waters stole the chord progression for Breathe from Neil Young's Down by the River. Then, of course, we get the wonderful cautionary tale at his time, then the mortality sequence before the tape loop really kicks in, all building to the orgasmic shudder that is Eclipse. This is a remarkable piece where the band are all working together as a band with one purpose, one objective. Of course, after that we get To Wish You Were Here, which is a study of loss and absence, central to that, which is the dazzling and brilliant metaphor of the Crazy Diamond. Then, of course, we get Roger Waters' Orwellian dystopian beast fable, which is Animals, which I have to say contains some of the finest guitar work Gilmour has ever produced. And then, of course, it goes all pear-shaped with that hymn to alienation, which is Wall in 1979. There's certainly no doubt that Pink Floyd were looking at very deep sort of philosophical concerns prior to this album. I mean, the whole idea of human empathy was explored before then, especially with the album, of course, the track, of course, Echoes, with its opening ping that introduces us to ideas of empathy, with its lyrics unashamedly borrowed, shall we say, or appropriated from the Beatles' I Am the Walrus and Across the Universe. But nevertheless, the writing was certainly on the wall, so to speak. Anyway, Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon is my number one progressive rock album. Some of you might be concerned, of course, that I've not actually included any US or indeed Canadian bands in my list. But, whereas I think that America did psychedelia much better than we did, I think British psychedelia is too whimsical and too concerned with sprites and teapots and things like that. However, in England and indeed Europe, I think lies the true heart of progressive rock music. However, there's no doubt that that spirit of ambition is very much apparent in American artists also. We get Zappa and the Mothers and the Beach Boys, of course, doing some wonderful things. Lots and lots of American bands, of course, doing some wonderful, ambitious stuff in the sort of 60s onwards. But I can't help but think they took their eye off the ball a little bit and became preoccupied with the meandering formlessness represented by the Summer of Love. But of course, while American audiences were turning on, tuning in and dropping out, we produced Sgt. Pepper, Days of Future Past, and we invite you all for an audience with the Court of the Crimson King in 1969. But that's just my opinion, of course. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy my musings on music, do click like, subscribe, and do check out the Facebook page. But more importantly, please do keep listening.